not a hired gun. I gotta feel there's some moral or constitutional issue at stake.
But I'm absolutely innocent.
Hi guys, welcome back to my little classic movie of the week. Today we're talking about Reversal of Fortune from 1990. This movie is about the Sonny Von Bulow case, which was absolutely huge all over the news in the 80s. The film itself was actually based off the book written by Alan Dershowitz. He was a law professor who worked on the appeal. So Klaus Von Bulow was accused of attempted murder of his wife Sonny, and he was found guilty of that, and then Alan Dershowitz worked on the appeal and actually overturned the conviction. So this case was like the case of the 80s, and I kind of like this film because I didn't really know. I really like true crime. I find it really interesting, and I just didn't really know much about this case. And I think the thing that is kind of at the core of this, of people's fascination, is partly the fact that these people were just so wealthy. And also Klaus Von Bulow himself he's just weird. Was weird. I think he died recently in the last couple of years. So he's a really weird guy, and his kind of, not like behavior, but like his attitude or his demeanor through the whole thing was very kind of arrogant and self-assured in a way that just made people feel like this guy is guilty, like he's not a good person. So this film came out in 1990, so just at that cusp of the end of the 80s when this case was so big. So it stars Jeremy Irons as Klaus. If you don't know who Jeremy Irons is, he's been in so many things. I was looking up some movies for him to be like, what would people, like, I mean, I know who he is, but what would people remember him from, you know? He's the voice of Scar in The Lion King. So he has that way of like having a menacing kind of drawl. He was in Dead Ringers. He was also in a movie called The Mission, which I'd kind of forgotten about until I was looking him up to be like some reference points for him. He used to be known as the thinking woman's like heartthrob, which I find really funny, because he's British and he does have a certain kind of way about him, but I also feel like he's so good at playing bad guys, you know. It was funny seeing The Mission because I don't know if anybody else kind of knows this film, but for some reason I remember being with my dad and we used to like watch this movie all the time. Like, why would little kids want to watch The Mission? No idea. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. Glenn Close plays Sonny Von Bulow. Glenn Close is famous for Fatal Attraction. She's also Cruella de Vil in some of the 101 Dalmatian remakes. I kind of love Glenn Close. She has this way of being, she's very beautiful and she has this lovely face, but when she wants to play a crazy person, she's so good at it. I love that about her. She's a really good performer. So because Sonny is in a coma, I really like in this film that Glenn Close as Sonny does a lot of voiceover for this, and she's still a person in this film. I feel like sometimes it's easy for these films to be about, you know, the lawyer and the criminal, or the victim is just a victim, whereas in this case the alleged victim has a voice and she's seen in flashbacks and she's sort of not minimized or forgotten, which I think is kind of really well done in this film. Ron Silver plays Alan Dershowitz. I always think Ron Silver, for me, he was in Time Cop and Law and Order, so I don't know if that, I feel like he's someone where you see his face and you're like, oh yeah, I know that guy, but then you may not like know his name. I don't know. That could just be me. He is joined by Annabella Sciorra, who was in Hand That Rocks the Cradle, which is kind of a film that for some reason is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, I think. It's not a bad film. I think she's really good in this and in everything I've seen her in. But I think Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female are two films that were kind of... I remember people talking about them and it being a bit like they were thrillers, you know, of their era. And when you watch them, they're so of their time. So they're two things that I just really like those movies for some reason. The director of this film, Barbet Schroeder, actually directed Single White Female. So there you go. So I guess the subject of this film, the Sonny Von Bulow case, I feel like these films about, you know, kind of crime or court case movies, sometimes they can be really movie of the week, you know? Not that I'm criticizing movie of the week films, because I quite like those too. But I think what really elevates this is Jeremy Irons at the center of this film as Klaus von Bülow. He's amazing. Like, Klaus is so horrible. Like, you cannot look away from this guy. Like, he's just... I think at some points he just calls Alan Dershowitz, like, the Jew and stuff like that. Like, he's arrogant. He's kind of weird. He's unsettling. And Jeremy Irons manages to be sort of... just really... I think... his performance of Klaus is one of the best villain performances. I know he's been on a few lists for that, and he did win an Oscar for this performance. He's just like, you just can't look away from him. You're like, this guy is so evil. I think this film doesn't really answer the question of if Klaus actually killed Sonny or not, because Alan Dershowitz got him off. So... I kind of like that about this film, is that there's enough evidence to show that Klaus may not have done it, and that's kind of, Alan Dershowitz was kind of making that point of like, you've got to convict people for real evidence. You can't just kind of convict someone on their demeanor. So I think that's kind of a really valid point, and he also took on the case by telling Klaus that he would have to pay for another case where people, I think there were two boys, I think, in another case in this film, and they needed defense. So Alan was like, well, okay, I'll take your case and you fund that case, you know? I think there's some really great scenes of Dershowitz, like, with his legal team. A lot of them are his students. And they sort of play basketball outside and discuss legal points and stuff. Like, their conversations are really interesting. They're not sort of hard to follow or overly, you know, legalese or anything like that. They're kind of points of law, and I don't know. I really enjoyed those scenes. I think what's nice about them is Klaus is kind of a weird, cold person, and he lives in this massive house, and he has Sonny and he have, I think, one kid together, and then there's some other older kids because she was married previously, and so they have this house where everything's kind of should be comforting, and yet in Dershowitz's house with his son and his friends, there's actually much more camaraderie and warmth. So I think it's a really nice juxtaposition. I think actually Dershowitz is a much richer person than Klaus, which I didn't think, it's not the point of the film or anything, but it's just something that I kind of found like that worked really well as a dynamic. Sonny Von Bülow herself, actually, after this movie I did a little Google, and she was amazing looking. Kind of a fascinating person. She was hypoglycemic, and there's lots of implications about them doing drugs and her being suicidal and all these different things. So there's you could make the case that she killed herself. There's lots of different, I'm not going to go into all of the points of law here, but there's also some interesting rumors that Klaus may have killed some of his family members back in Europe. He seemed to have a lot of lovers outside of the marriage. And also Sonny was the one that sort of had the money, so he couldn't really afford to divorce her if he wanted to be with someone else. So I find that really interesting because, you know, a lot of kind of sociopaths have that, like, promiscuity, affairs, you know, all these different things that you could kind of line up with Klaus and be like, you know, you could make the case that this guy did it, but I mean, he was found guilty and then he was found not guilty. So I think that's a really, like, great thing about this film, is that it's sort of, it introduces you to this case. And I don't know, I think the impression I get is that Alan Dershowitz thought he was guilty, but like didn't think that the case was brought against him properly. And that's kind of important, because if you can bring a case against someone who has the money to have a lawyer and make them guilty, you know, it's your job to prove that they're guilty. So you need to have that proof, you know? And I think if for Alan Dershowitz, he was like, you know, it's one thing to do that against a big guy, but if you do it against a big guy and you get away with it, then the little guy doesn't have a chance. So you need to keep the law legal, you know? So I think all of those kinds of points are really interesting and make for a really good film. I think it's a good sort of Sunday afternoon watch. I think you could just watch it just for Jeremy Irons. He's so good at these movies. Yeah, so that's basically Reversal of Fortune. I think if anyone has if anyone's listened to a good little crime podcast about Sonny Von Bulow, let me know, because I'd like to know more about this case. There seems to be a lot of convolution, and I kind of left this film thinking, like, I feel like he did this, but then I'm like, maybe he didn't actually do this. Maybe he didn't kill her. I don't know. So, yeah, it's just a cool movie. Cool little classic movie. And I don't really see anyone talking about this movie that much. I do think it is a little, other than Jeremy Irons and Glenn Close, and I think the way the film's edited with the kind of flashbacks, and like, it's really well shot, but it definitely, I don't know, it could have very easily become one of those TV movies, you know? So, yeah, that's Reversal of Fortune. It's from 1990 if you're looking for it. Yeah, and let me know what you think in the comments, if you think he did it or not. I want to know.